Hi, everybody. So welcome to this event. Wow, it's much louder than I thought it was going to be. To moderate my voice a little bit. Welcome to CGEP's event. The Center on Global Energy Policy every semester brings a couple of distinguished visitors through Columbia, gives them a chance to interact with Columbia faculty, Columbia students, and also to give a general interest presentation. And today we're doing exactly that with Professor Destenie Nock. Welcome, Destenie.
Thank you.
From Carnegie Mellon University, where she teaches in the School of Engineering and Public Policy. Destenie is an engineer by training. She was an expert on systems that generate and distribute energy. And she's done a lot of very interesting work on what's loosely called energy policy and energy poverty, energy policy as well, actually, but in particular energy poverty, which is the essentially the relationship between being poor and having an inadequate amount of energy to meet your needs. And so Destenie is going to talk for 15 or so minutes, and then she and I will have a conversation to elaborate on some of the points that she's been making. And then after that, the session will be open to Q&A, both from you and the present in the audience here, and also people who are taking part in this online. And if you're online, by the way, and I can't see any cameras, but I assume there is a camera somewhere. Oh, back there. Okay, great. Thank you. If you're online, then you can submit questions via the Q&A facility on Zoom. And they'll be written down and handed to me here. So I will see your questions if you submit them on Zoom. Okay, so without further ado, Destenie, it's over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So thanks everyone for coming. So I just wanted to start off by getting a gauge of who's in the room. So sorry, people on Zoom. This is the benefit to the people that showed up in person. So can you raise your hand if you've ever kept your house hotter in the summer than you would have liked in order to save money on your bills? Okay, so we got about 15. Okay, how about in the winter? So have you ever kept your house colder in the winter than you would have liked in order to save money on your bills? All right, we got substantially more people that do that, right? And I think that this highlights one of the challenges with the way that we are trying to address energy poverty right now, is that we often look at electricity demand as this is what people want to have, right? So then when we deploy energy efficient technologies, we think, oh, there's this rebound effect because people are magically using more energy, but we forget to ask, where did you want to be in the first place? Right. And so I'm going to share a little bit about my story about how I have come to conceptualize energy poverty based on my experience. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how I am working on incorporating that into my research and also into my startup company. So I grew up in Maryland near a nuclear power plant with very consistent electricity. Right. Then I do a study abroad in Malawi. And I learned that there are things called rolling blackouts where the government will just tell you you're going to get a blackout on Thursday and it can show up whenever it wants to show up, right? And so that was in 2012. And I'm sitting here thinking, why is this happening in 2012? We're deploying new technologies, we're doing a lot of R&D, but we still haven't gotten what we have to work properly. Right. And so then the mismanagement of these systems led me to UMass Amherst, where I did a PhD in industrial engineering to look at actual technology deployment and those types of systems. So then when I was at Amherst, you know, we paid grad students so much, right? Double the minimum wage. I looked it up, and we were keeping our heat on 55 because that was the lowest temperature we could keep it on without our pipes freezing. Right. And my roommate and I used to argue about whether or not she could cut it off because she thought, well, we are in an oil heating system. It's very expensive. We're not even here for most of the day. We should just cut it off. And I'm like, if you cut this off and I have to pay for this pipe bursting, you know, I'm not gonna send that letter to my landlord. Right. So we're limiting our energy consumption, and then we get disconnected because we just couldn't afford to pay that bill for electricity. And we chose to pay the heating bill because we're like, oh, our pipes, we don't want our pipes to freeze, not thinking that if you don't pay your electricity bill, the thermostat will not ever tell your system to kick on in the first place. And so when you get disconnected, you basically turn your house into a giant tent, right? That has structure, right? So then I realized, oh, like I'm making double minimum wage and I still can't afford to keep my own heat on, right? And then when we look at the summer, people are experiencing this at the same time, but they are putting themselves at risk of heat illness and heat death. And in Maricopa County, one county in Arizona, 228 people died over a 10-year period, despite all of them having air conditioning units, right? So that brings us to the second, illumination of poverty, where people aren't using it and they're hidden in poverty. They have the technology. They live in a county that has complete reliability, except for, winter storms and things like that, but mostly reliable. But they just still can't afford to use it, right? And then when we're thinking, okay, well, maybe that's just happening in the South, but in New York, 36 people had died over an 8-year period. And those are just the ones that we know of, because when you have a heat-related illness or death, the doctor has a lot of leeway in how they report it, because you may have fainted and hit your head, right? You may have gotten dehydrated, and then that's how you would have had an unfortunate passing. So my work has been about how do we identify who is hidden in energy poverty, and then how do we make sure that those people get covered in the policies, in our technology deployment, and then how we are actually thinking about this energy transition, because a lot of us said, I have not used a lot of energy to save money on our bills, right? Or I turn my thermostat up and down. And so when we're thinking about the universal access target, right, there's a lot in there about generation and deployment, but how much is in there about monitoring of actual usage after these systems got deployed, especially as we're thinking about climate adaptation, right, climate change, temperatures rising, especially for people who are living in places where it may not get that hot for most of the year, and they don't want to buy the AC for a 2-week heat wave. And you may have enough money to support yourself for 2 days, but when it gets to 2 weeks, now you're entering the danger zone, right? And that's a big problem that we need to think about in this equitable energy transition. So as we are thinking about policies and how to craft policies, one of the things that I will challenge everybody to think about is, what type of barrier am I trying to help people overcome? And talking to people about what has been missed, what are their pain points? Because I think that's something that we miss a lot. And what are my own pain points that are not able to get overcome right now? And so one of the things that I want to just point out is, in my research, we have partnered with utility companies to take people's electricity consumption data and actually look at how they use it. So in Maricopa County, back to the one I first mentioned, we did a study over a 4-year period, and we were looking at when different demographic groups turn on their air conditioning units, just turn it on, right? And we were seeing that high-income groups would turn on their air conditioning units 4 to 7 degrees earlier in the summer than low-income groups, right? So this gap, it's a pretty big gap, right, in terms of the outdoor temperature. And then we did another study in Chicago just to see, okay, we're looking at different climates, is the same phenomenon happening? So we found in Chicago, the gap was 3 to 6 degrees of a difference for AC units. But then in the winter, we had the opposite effect, right? Where low-income groups turn on their heat 8 to 9 degrees earlier than high-income groups. So now we have different seasons, different effect of poverty. In the summer, when you can leave your house, you can go to work, you are more likely to put yourself at risk of heat illness and heat death. And in the winter, because you're stuck in your house, insulation becomes a big issue, you're more likely to put yourself in debt, right, in order to cope, because it's at night and you want to go to sleep. And it's hard to sleep when it's 55 degrees. If you never had 55 degrees setting on your thermostat, I will confirm that wearing a winter coat to bed is not fun, right? So that's what I do in both my research and in my startup company, People's Energy Analytics. And so I'm happy to have this discussion, happy to talk about how we can craft more equitable policies, and just excited to hear what you guys want to talk about.
Well, thanks, Destiny. But tell us a bit more about your company. It sounds fascinating, and it's unusual for someone like you to be both an academic and running a company.
Yeah. Okay, so People's Energy Analytics is focused on creating data-driven solutions for addressing energy poverty and answering energy transition questions. So we have created models that can look at energy consumption and how technology deployment, different changes in prices in the utility space will impact energy consumption and also affordability and energy poverty. And I think for us, one of our big drivers is right now, we saw a news article that said 20 million Americans are behind on their energy bills, which has led to $22 to $32 billion of debt for gas and electric utilities. So people are, and then the solution, right? Moratorium. So now you have moratorium where people are getting deeper into debt. And when the moratorium lifts, it's like, how do you get out of that debt, right? You still had the problem, right? And you were just saving it for the heat wave. But that means now if I'm protected during the moratorium, it ends, and then another heat wave happens, I still am disconnected. I never got to get back on. And so when I had talked to one of my friends in the utility industry, they were saying that the states are asking utilities to just write it off, right? And that's not a sustainable business. And so we believe that with my company, we can use data analytics to think about more effective energy efficiency deployments, right? And actually how we measure the success of these deployments. So right now, the number one way that people define energy poverty is if you spend more than 10% of your income on your bills, right? That is the most commonly used metric. But under that metric, none of the homeless are energy poor, right? Because you have to pay your housing rent, right? You have to pay your rent, you have to pay your taxes. If you don't have a house, then that 10% metric will miss you, right? And then also it doesn't take into account, do you even have an air conditioning unit? Because landlords are not required to supply those, right? And so for that, we're now looking at the infrastructure divide. So helping with targeting of who doesn't have an air conditioning unit, whose slope, right? So the rate at which you increase your energy usage as the temperatures outside get hotter, who's so flat that I would expect them to be living in a third world country, right? That's actually something that we can identify using the smart meter data. And so now we're moving out of surveys, which is the most common way we try to find the lived experience, into let's use this scalable data sets that utilities are already collecting and try to use that to identify who needs help.
So you're looking basically for people whose energy consumption is not responding when the temperature goes up.
Yeah.
And you think that's a good lead onto who's sort of energy poor.
Yes, because in the household, the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning should take up 30 to 60% of the load in the building. So the electricity demand, 30 to 60% should come from the heating, ventilating, and air conditioning. Okay. Now, if you are not having that response, right, and I see a very flat curve, then I could say, well, is their AC broken and they can't afford to fix it? So now there's this infrastructure barrier. Is it that they have it and they feel like they can't afford to use it, and now it's actual, money barrier? Right. Or is there some other reason? But I know that they're not responding as I would expect them to. And I think that, with energy, a lot of it is trying to figure out how to capture what it looks like and what it feels like. Because, with food, you'd go to the doctor, you would measure your vitamin levels, right? You're not getting enough vitamin A or whatever. But with energy, it's all secondary, right? Like, are you using your thermostat? Or is your fridge still plugged in, right? That happened to me in Ghana. They were not plugging in that fridge, and that food did not stay well for as long as I thought it should have, So then that's why we think the temperature response is a good behavior metric for poverty, and because it's also directly tied to health, right? Yeah. So it goes back to cold-related illness, cold-related death, and also heat-related illness and death.
Yeah. So now, let me a couple of questions that seem natural on top of that. One is, how does energy poverty relate to poverty generally? People who are energy poor are presumably poor in an overall sense. Are they dependent on Social Security? Are they dependent on welfare payments? What do you know about their general economic situation? Are they unemployed? Are they employed but not making enough money? And do you have any kind of demographic information about these people?
Yeah, I think that for the energy poor, there is this multiple effects of poverty, right? Normally, poverty doesn't exist in a vacuum. Right. So if you are energy poor, that can actually dive you deeper into food poverty. Because when I got disconnected, right, I had to magically get rid of all of my freezer food, right? And the freezer wasn't working, the fridge wasn't working. And then you're also dealing with the health concerns. Not so, you know, the illness and the death is one thing, but if you have an oxygen tank, right? If you have a lift in your home that you need to have because you have a disability and you need the lift to actually get, you know, in your on your second floor, right? Then all of a sudden that doesn't work. You can't charge your the motorized wheelchairs, right? And so now you have this transportation poverty, right? And then also being poor is very expensive. I mean, when I was in, so my family, a part of my family is from Tuskegee, and it's a predominantly Black area in Alabama. And when you try to buy gas there, it is 50 cents more than when you go to Auburn, which is the white area. So we'll drive 20 minutes and go get it in Auburn, but we also deal with reliability issues. The housing is more expensive, but it's also more dilapidated. Yeah. So then you have more issues of house poverty. And so it is a compounding effect. And that's why I think with policies, I think we could really think critically about how we tackle that administrative burden for addressing poverty, because we know that people are dealing with the multiple forms. So I'll give you an example. I'm a landlord. Don't hate me, students. Okay. And we got this refugee family from Afghanistan. And so we've been housing them, but there's the language barrier, but then there's also the issue with helping them get infrastructure. So our houses, a lot of houses in Pittsburgh don't have AC units. And we were like, okay, you guys need to, you know, here's some places you can get an AC unit, whatever one you want. But then it was like they bought the most inefficient small AC unit and put it in the open concept living room, right? And so this thing's running all the time. And I'm like, this is the worst thing from an engineering standpoint. I mean, like, you know, it just got me right in my heart of the engineering efficiency, right? So then I tell my husband, he's a real landlord and he keeps the business mindset of it. And I keep like I study energy poverty, and, you know, this person is a pregnant mom. She has a newborn baby. We need a better AC unit. And my husband's like, well, that's not how you run this business, right? And it really helped me learn about why landlords do not do well for energy transition, because it's not like our cost is minimize that cost. And I told I wrote them a letter. I don't think they've read it, but the electricity company, I bought this family an AC unit. You guys should give me a rebate because I just helped you guys get more profit, right? Right. But they didn't write me back. Sad ending, but a good ending for the family. But then we had another family downstairs that was on Section 8 to get the housing voucher. Right. I was on Section 8 I was on the phone with Section 8 for 6 months before I got paid. Wow. Right. Wow. And so then when you think about this family also needed food stamps, the Section 8 family also needed food stamps. She also needed the LIHEAP, low income housing energy assistance program assistance, right? We would have loved to get WAP to insulate that home, but because I make too much as a landlord, I don't qualify. So the family loses out, right? And I'm like, well, I just bought this house. So, and my house doesn't even have insulation in the kitchen. So, you know, it's like, there's nothing I can do. And the lady, when we were talking with her, the Section 8 person, she was like, oh, like, yeah, we'll like get you guys this, just like, we promise we'll back pay you. And you're like, okay, you're expecting landlords to build on these promises, but this mortgage has to get paid by somebody. Right. And the bank doesn't take IOUs, you know, whether they're coming from the government or me. And so I think that is also like a challenge of how we addressed this poverty issue, because so many times you have to do all these different silos. And everybody needs help. And so we make it really hard for the poor to ask for help.
Yeah, no, that's notorious, and that's really outrageous too in many ways. Yeah. But I mean, so are there ways of tackling this without a root and branch reform of the whole welfare system? I mean, can you see changes which could be made, you know, just sort of plausible in political terms that could be carried out, which would actually reduce the extent of energy poverty?
Yeah, so I think one of the easiest changes would be to change the way we qualify people. So right now,
qualify for what? For
energy assistance.
Okay, yeah, right.
So one thing that I've seen as really effective is a poverty wallet. So if you qualify for food stamps, the housing voucher, or anything else, you automatically qualify for these other social services. It would lower the administrative burden for the people to actually sign up. And then also, you then would let these low-income families know the other services that they potentially qualify for, because a lot of them just don't know.
Yeah, right.
And so then that's, I think, one way to lower the administrative burden and make more effective policy. Another potential avenue is to change and widen our definition of who qualifies for assistance. So right now we do it based on gross income, but that misses rent, right? So if I'm spending 80% of my income on my rent because I live, I don't know, in the middle of a very big city, like New York, right? Then it's very unlikely that I will spend more than 10% of my income on my energy bills, because I have food, right? I have just shoes for my kids. You know, I have daycare costs if we do that.
Yeah.
And so I think that that is one other avenue for trying to get a handle on the scope of the problem. I actually have talked to some LAHEAP administrators about that, but then their concern is, well, what if I don't have enough money to help everyone? And my, I guess, pushback is, if you don't identify everyone that needs help, you never will, right? And so you probably aren't even asking for the right amount of money.
Yeah, I see. So, I mean, how extensive is energy policy? I mean, you talked about, particularly, you've done a lot of work in Maricopa County, where obviously it's heat that's the issue there. I mean, you mentioned like a few hundred deaths over a number of years, but I mean, what fraction of the population do you think is actually not consuming enough energy to be, not consuming as much energy as they should from a health perspective?
Well, at the minimum, 20 million Americans, because that's the number of Americans that are behind on their bills. Right now, so minimum 20 million.
But 20 million people or 20 million households?
I think it was 20 million people, but I will double check that. Sorry, I won't be able to get back to everyone on Zoom. But yeah, I believe it was 20 million Americans was the tagline that I read.
Right.
And so when you think about that many people, I mean, it's a lot of people, right? I think the EIA did their REC study, and I believe they said that 10% of people in their survey reported keeping their house at unhealthy or unsafe temperatures in order to cope with financial strain, right? So about 10% then of Americans are dealing with the temperature piece. And then you have people who are behind on their bills. And that's the thing, right? People don't like being in debt.
No.
Right? I mean, I feel like there's this desire, right, of people to, I got my own, I'm independent, right? And so the fact that there are so many people behind, it just kind of speaks to this larger need to really think about how we define who needs help and how we help them.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. You spent some time in Africa. I mean, tell us more. What were you doing there, and what did you learn from that? Now, obviously, there's energy policy extensively in developing countries, but it's a different phenomenon there, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that it's more at the beginning. So we talk a lot about the supply side and the reliability when I was in Africa. So I did an electricity stakeholder workshop in Ghana. And when we were there, our big study was on, what do you actually want to use electricity for? And let's make sure we're planning for the right thing, right? So I think a lot of times, at least in the US, when I talk to people about the developing world, it's light bulbs and cook stoves, right? But when I went to Ghana, one of the chiefs, he was like, I paid kerosene all my money, and now I pay electricity all my money, right? And he's like, I just want more money. And it was a good reminder about the fact that people want a transition to lead a better, healthier life. And if you can give them that, they will gladly switch. But when we were hosting the workshop, we realized there was a large lack of understanding in how they were even being charged for their electricity bills, right? There was concerns about the lack of reliability. And then when I asked, okay, well, we got these problems, so let's think about the system that we want. And the chief was like, I want a sustainable system. I'm like, okay, that's great. Like, what type of sustainability do you want? He goes, I want wind. I was like, okay, why do you want wind? He goes, to grind my grains, right? And so, you know, if I had just stopped at the sustainability piece, then we might have thought he was talking about the environmental sustainability, but he was really zoning in on the economic sustainability. Right. When people were saying they wanted small modular reactors for nuclear, they were really zoning in on, to bring manufacturing into our country, we need baseload technologies that can really sustain that high product output for manufacturing. And so that was their goal. And they didn't care how they got there as long as they got the manufacturing jobs, right? And so I think that that is one of the really, I guess, needs for when we're thinking about, like, what does achievement of the universal access target look like? And what does sustainable development, like, what's the outcome of that? I think that too often we forget to ask people, where do you want to be and why? And like dig deeper to the fundamental thing that they feel like they're lacking. And so that's one thing that I try to do.
Interesting. Now we're in the process of making a sort of almost unprecedented transformation of the energy system at the moment, trying to move away from fossil fuels towards non-fossil energy sources. Does that impact the issues that you're interested in?
Of course. Yeah. I feel like with the energy transition, when we talk about energy justice, there's multiple lenses, right? So there's the bills. There's, if you're living near polluting plants, right? You also want clean air. And so when I talk with people about redevelopment and, you know, retiring these plants, a lot of it is thinking, okay, we'll just retire that plant and then somewhere else we'll build another power plant. It's like, oh, wait, no. That community wants those jobs. They just don't want to have to deal with the smog and the sulfur and the negative environmental impacts on their water and their air, but they still want those jobs, right? So I think really thinking about how this energy transition works for communities is important. And also the trade-offs that we get, right? I think that we're kidding ourselves if we think any type of energy transition will magically be good on all fronts, right? Because you have transmission build out that you need that will raise prices. And building infrastructure is very expensive. We talk about, you know, how much are we going to have to overbuild this system, right? Because wind and solar are very variable, and then we need more storage. But I think the benefit of trying to get ahead of it and really forecast, well, you know, what are the potential pain points, is then we have opened ourselves for other opportunities. So for example, with the identification of these groups that are waiting really long time to turn on their air conditioning units, you know, we've heard of, has anybody heard of the duck curve? Right. Okay. I got some people who didn't. So I'm going to explain to the duck curve. So there's a peak in the morning for electricity load, and then it goes down and you have this belly of the duck, and then it goes back up in the evening and it tapers off. Okay. So that's how the electricity demand looks, the duck curve. So normally, the way the ideal electricity system would be very flat, right? You can have this many generators and you don't have to have any more. But when you have this belly of the duck and you're going up, you need a lot of ramping. It actually has a lot of emissions in the short period of time. So a lot of people talk about, well, let's just cut off the head of the duck, right? And we're going to stop people from over consuming in the evening. We're going to do some more energy efficiency and take it down. But we know that there are a lot of people that feel like they can't consume energy. So a missed opportunity, right, is to fill in the belly of the duck. We know that people aren't using it. Electricity companies know they're behind. We could actually subsidize the middle and allow people to use more solar, use more wind, right? And actually then we would be kind of getting more to that flat curve that we would like. So I think that there is, in this energy transition, we've been focused so much on the supply side of, well, we just need more wind and solar, but we also could, you know, use demand response and make the demand a little bit more flexible and offer people to get to where they want to be.
Now, you mentioned the case of sort of low-income communities that currently have fossil power plants, and obviously they're going to gain from those plants being closed down because there's less pollution, but they would like to keep the jobs. But that isn't going to happen, is it? Because I mean, wind and solar you can't build wind and solar power plants inside a city. I mean, they have to be built a long way away, and they employ very little labor anyway. Yeah. So I mean, we need to find some other way of handling the job implications of the transition, particularly for low-income groups.
Yeah, but I think, you know, when you have small modular reactors, right, when you're thinking about this hydrogen build out, when you're thinking about manufacturing of electric vehicles, because we're really behind. I mean, there's a huge supply shortage of electric vehicles, right? So where are you going to put these things? Well, wherever you're retiring coal and oil plants, that's very flat, unused land that had a lot of technology on it, right? And so that could be an incentive that we could think about for policies of, you know, these sites are going down, but we want to make sure that we don't just lose everything that was already here. We don't want to devastate these communities. Let's make sure that we replace this with something for this transition instead of going to another community and tearing down that community and building the, you know, EV plant over there. Let's redevelop this and do the redevelopment as we transition. Yeah, right.
So now talking about costs, the transition to renewable energy should in principle reduce energy costs because, you know, the fuel costs for sun and wind are zero. Mm-hmm. And the capital costs are actually somewhat lower than the capital costs for, say, combined cycle power plants or certainly the nuclear power plants. So in principle, we're bringing down the cost, and that should make it easier to structure it for you know, low-income people to be able to afford a decent amount of energy. But I mean, currently the pricing system is so complicated that, I mean, you know, when I look at my Con Ed bill, I'm paying like roughly 20 cents a kilowatt hour, mm-hmm. and roughly 10 cents of that is for the energy. And the rest of it is for transmission lines and other sort of fixed costs of one sort or another. I mean, have you ever thought about actually changing the way we charge for electricity and pricing electricity radically much nearer to marginal cost, which would make it actually much cheaper at the point of use?
I think that getting it to go to the marginal cost is going to miss the fact that the transmission and distribution lines are always there, regardless of how much it costs you to generate at that moment. So that is one reason why I don't think that it will go down to the marginal cost. I do believe like there are the deregulated electricity markets where, you know, power plants bid, and so that does naturally bring it a little bit closer to their marginal cost. But the issue is that they're playing this bidding game over and over and over again, that they learn how it's going to work, right? So they can test out, okay, well, you know, how low can I really go? Do I have to go to my marginal cost, or is it going to be that these gas plants are all going to be the marginal person? And so now we have this understanding about where we need to bid in to set that target price. Yeah. And I think the other thing too is that because you have the ramping needs and you have these peaking generators that you're going to have to keep online to satisfy, you know, the head and the tail of the duck. Yeah. You're not going to be able to completely get rid of all of those. I mean, maybe you're going to need more storage, but then you have energy arbitrage going on, right? Or you're going to need something that can ramp really quickly, and wind and solar can't always do that. So whether it be storage or natural gas.
You know, there's clearly a role for batteries or something like that. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Now, you've mentioned a couple of times, you've mentioned small modular reactors. I mean, does that mean that you think that there's a future for nuclear power via the SMRs?
Yeah, but I think I'm a little biased because I grew up near the Calvert Cliffs nuclear power plant. I see. So my mom's a security guard there, and you know, we actually never really knew it was there, to be honest. I think that a lot of times people believe that people who live near nuclear power plants are always freaked out because, you know, you're worried about the risk or something. But after about 2 years, you kind of just forget that something is behind those trees, right? And I think that with the Calvert Cliffs plant, it supplies half of DC and all of lower Maryland and a part of Virginia. It's very efficient. And you can put it really close to the city. And it just works, right? And so I think that that's why, for me, I feel like I try to be more technology agnostic, where I want the system to work for everyone, right? And I think that with the wind build out and the solar build out, that is something that will happen and needs to happen. But also, do I think that we can hit all of our base load for how intensive and energy wise that our industries are? I think that'd be very difficult
to
do.
Right. Okay. So you want to see nuclear as part of a base load.
Yeah.
Essentially. Yeah. Yeah, I tend to agree with that, but I'm also prejudiced. I used to work for the nuclear power companies.
Okay.
So a long time ago. So I started life as a nuclear engineer.
Yeah, I think so often people are like, I only want solar, I only want wind, I only want nuclear, like this technology bad, that technology good. And it's really like, I want the system to work because there is this benefit of a very, centralized generation that is low cost. Because when we're thinking about, the solar rollout, I think that a lot of people are proposing rooftop solar, but then you get into, any city with skyscrapers, and anybody who lives in an apartment complex is going to have a hard time benefiting from that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Anybody who lives in a townhome, anybody that doesn't own their roof, or, renters are going to be cut out too, because landlords just don't want to fix stuff that they don't have to until it's breaking and they have to. And that's something that maybe it's a part of it's going to have to be changing the model of landlords, or, what we require them, what standards we require them for housing, because you don't really solve energy poverty without solving housing poverty.
What you're saying, we need to solve the problem of distribution of income. That's a big problem. Yeah.
I think that we need to also think about what quality of life, what minimum quality of life do we want people to have, right? When I have talked to people about, the fact that low-income groups wait 7 degrees longer sometimes to turn on their AC units. One person told me, I don't want to pay people to overconsume. And it's like, okay, well, what is the minimum threshold for safety of energy consumption in a house? And nobody knows, right? If you think about your appliances, right? Is somebody overconsuming when they have a television, right? Because you can go to the gym. I've done it. If you don't want to pay for that cable, just get on the treadmill, right? Are you overconsuming when you have an electric vehicle or more than one fridge? Or, what does it look like? How much do people need to consume to keep a safe temperature in their home? We know the temperature that you need to keep your thermostat set on. We don't know how that translates to actual energy usage. And so I think that is a big challenge. When I talked to a LAHEAP administrator, she was telling me that some people in her program consume so little that they are consuming less than the average person in Kenya.
Wow.
Right. And you're like, okay, well, I think that they are in an energy deficit, right? And the question is, where should we help them get to?
Is there any data on how many kilowatt hours per year a kind of a family of 3 or 4 should consume in order to maintain a safe living standard? Is there any data at all of that sort? I've never seen anything like that. But
I've never seen anything like it either.
No.
And I think it's because when I've asked people about it, so I've asked some utility colleagues about it, they're like, well, it depends on, the appliances and this and this and this. It depends on the age of the home and this. And so people are like, it's just too complicated, right? And so then we don't do it. But then the problem is we don't do that, right? And so then we all of a sudden are like, okay, we want people to be very energy efficient. And so then you get this household that has a very flat curve and they look energy efficient, but it's actually poverty.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, interesting. Go back to a question I asked before. I'd like to see if you've got any more detail on this. What is the connection between energy poverty and overall poverty? Is that, how many of the people that you're picking up, do you let me put it a different way. When you pick up someone, a family or household as energy poverty because of this flat response curve, can you get any more information about them from the utilities or from any other source? Can you get are they unemployed? Are they on welfare? Stuff like that?
I guess the closest we get to that is we do have indication on if they make less than $15,000 a year. In terms of income. So if that's the case, then they would be assumed to be unemployed,
right,
or only working a part-time job, because when you make minimum wage, you should get about $15,000 a year.
Yeah. Okay.
So keep that in mind. Minimum wage, you only get $15,000 a year, right? And that's if you have a full-time minimum wage job. And most people are actually working multiple jobs, right? And so then they most likely don't have a car. Sometimes you can get a sense about vehicle ownership from the census tract information, but it's very rare that a utility would have that information. And it's because, again, we're in these silos, right? So I don't have actual health data on how often this person goes to the emergency room. I don't have that tied to energy consumption data. It's also proprietary, and there's a lot of privacy concerns there,
Yeah.
when you're getting into the individual level. So I think even if they had it, they wouldn't share it.
Yeah.
But then we also have, concerns about housing, right? And food. And there's not really a large scale data way to collect information on food. I mean, maybe I could do it with like grocery spending, but people eat out. And so there's not a lot of data on that. And I think that that's why I say like poverty is often very hidden, because one thing we know about poor people is they hate admitting that they're poor, right? Yeah. And when I was telling one of my roommates that I started going to the food bank, he goes, "But you don't look poor." And I'm like, "Well, what does a poor person look like?" I don't want to look poor, like so then I think that is a challenge with the conceptualization about what poor people look like, as well. Yeah. And also just how we determine who we have in our minds of who needs help.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for that. So it's time now to throw this open to the audience, to Q&A from the audience or from online for that matter. Any questions for Destenie? Yeah, gentleman there.
First, thank you very much for being with us today and sharing these insights.
Thanks.
One key aspect of energy poverty as well is the access to innovation that can allow you to consume less gas-related ingredients or doing upgrades inside the home. I was wondering if you could speak about that, perhaps. Thank you very much. Let me repeat the question. So one of the key elements of energy poverty also is the disparity between those who can afford energy upgrades and those who cannot. I was wondering if you could speak about perhaps research you have conducted on that field, or how we can help through policies people that do not have the needs to make upgrades in their home to be more energy efficient, get access to these upgrades that for now remain mostly the preserve of people who can afford it.
Yeah, thanks for that. So one thing that, so I guess this is more exploring it on our startup side. I haven't seen the research so much, but in the industry, we have traditionally looked at supply side deployment for the electricity utilities, but now I think people are thinking a lot about demand side deployment technologies. And so when you're thinking about, your energy efficient AC units, deploying weatherization, those are infrastructure investments that the utilities can make. Now, the question is, how do you price the cost recovery? So the traditional model has been about whoever's living in the home pays for it, right? But with the utility industry, they are the load management, the asset managers. And so if they had front the cost for that, right, then you can tie the cost recovery to the meter on the building. So no matter who is living in that dwelling, the utility is still going to get their money back because that address has a 2-cent increase on their bill for the next 15 years, regardless of who's there. So I think that can be another avenue for helping renters, right? Now, the thing is, okay, how do you price that? And so that's one of the reasons why, we're looking more at energy consumption. How does actually changing your energy efficient appliances or deploying appliances, how does that change energy consumption and how much people are spending? Because you don't want to raise the price on the meter so high that then people can't afford to use whatever you invested in. But I think that they're called smart utility investments. Clean Energy Works is the nonprofit that I've heard of, helping utility companies think about that. So taking the, burden of buying off of the dweller and then tying that to a long-term, it's almost like a loan. I think it's called a pay as you save. It could be one way to help tackle poverty in that sense. Mm-hmm. There's also one in the green back there that we can't see.
Oh, right. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sorry. Hello, my name is Juan Carlos. I'm from Mexico. Do you have any international kind of idea of energy poverty as well, or do you have some information? Because, for example, with COP27 happening right now in Egypt, well, it's also at least in Mexico, we still have people dying from they just overnight they have coal warming up their homes, and they just leave the windows closed, and they pretty much get asphyxiated. Is that the word? So do you have any ideas of how could we address that also in other countries, maybe through energy giving people energy independence. Sometimes the grid, maybe like microgrids or something that they don't have to rely on, maybe not the most efficient governments, not say Mexico, but like, you know.
Yeah, so I think when I think about energy in the in other countries, I like this framework of there's 5 facets of energy access, right? So there's the supply side. Is there a connection in your home, in your town, or what have you? Then there's the quantity. So how many appliances can you connect? Can you just do light bulbs? Can you do AC units, right? If you're thinking about, why were they burning the coal in their homes? Was it for cooking? Was it for heating? Did they have enough electricity and connections in their home to be able to use other appliances or not? Of course, there's the affordability piece, which we've touched on a lot. There's the quality side of it, meaning are you getting brownouts, so where your appliances just aren't working, right? Or are you getting blackouts? That's more on the reliability side. So then we have the reliability side. And so really it's about trying to address like which pain point is causing this issue in this home, right? And I think that that's where the conversation sometimes doesn't zone in on the fact that energy poverty isn't just this one thing, right? It appears in many different ways, and trying to get at what are those is, I think, the biggest challenge for addressing it. So when I was in Ghana, in the southern part, in Accra, they were really focused on management, affordability, and reliability. They wanted more generation in the north because when they had a power shortage in the south, they had nowhere else to get electricity. So they were really concerned with reliability. When we went to the north in Tamale, they wanted supply because they wanted supply, right? And they were not even thinking about reliability, or they were also thinking about affordability concerns because microgrids are more expensive, right? And then with solar panels on the homes, it's great for lighting and phone charging, but after that, you're really going to have to exponentially increase the number of panels you have to get to enough generation for the AC unit, right? And so that was another thing that they were talking about there. So, but I think the starting point is like the 5 facets, and then really zoning in on which one are people trying to tackle.
Interesting.
Hello, I have a question about, you mentioned it earlier about ramping capacity and like filling in the like body of the duct. What are your opinions on using energy storage for that measure? Do you think energy arbitrage using those mechanisms is like a good thing, or using the ramping products that like FERC or other ISOs are looking into? And then a second question on, do you have any concerns with the IRA subsidies on electrification for energy efficiency programs in the home, and whether or not those are being properly targeted to those who don't have the resources to pay for those improvements upfront?
Okay. So for the ramping concerns, I think that the way that generators make their money now, it's unlikely that a large storage facility would actually want to sell back to the grid in the valley of the duct, because the prices are going to be much lower, right? So you get your profit if you sell during the peaks, right? And so they're going to want to hold all of their electricity supply send back until the peak, right? And so I think that I think that storage could have that, but the incentive would have to be right. And just in a deregulated market, the way it's structured right now, I don't see that happening. For the IRA, throughout this whole thing, I feel like we've talked a lot about like how you actually make sure investments get to people in a meaningful way, in the way that accomplishes and solves their pain point. And so I do have concerns that with the vulnerable populations that we've identified, right? We're trying to solve problems that have historically happened due to discrimination without talking about race, right? So, to me, that is a huge concern. And then also, how do we evaluate who needs help and who's vulnerable? So when we look at these vulnerable indices, right, where are these indices overlapping? And so where are we going to hit the same people? And then the other question is, who's going to be left out, right? So I've seen indices on like cancer risk and contaminants and income, but then if we're not putting in race into that, like sometimes people racially are being hit, but we're not taking into account housing discrimination, right? We're not taking into account redlining and exclusion. And that's, to me, a big concern, because, you know, equitable policies didn't get us into this mess, right? And so now we're trying to ignore what made them inequitable to try to solve it. And so I think it's a big concern for me.
I gotta pick up a point there. There's a comment that came in from Zoom, from over the internet, saying that you know, rich people have access to much better equipment, much lower marginal cost equipment, and much more effective equipment for maintaining the right temperature in their homes. So it's sort of there's a perverse effect there. Yeah,
and I think that's why the low-income groups waiting much longer to cool their homes was striking, because you would expect rich houses to have better insulation, and higher ceilings and newer windows, so it shouldn't feel as hot as early. So the gap could actually be a lot wider than we have just found, because and then also we would expect their slopes to be much lower because they're very energy efficient, and that's just not what we were seeing.
I see. Interesting. Question at the back there. Oh, sorry, somebody there. Yeah, someone's got the mic. Yes, please.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, I think when you mentioned your travels to Ghana, that just like reminded me of like one of the events we had during Climate Week. And we had this person come who had this startup giving credits for the implementation of solar units and batteries, I think in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I wanted to ask you, do you think, like, do you find stakeholders like this one in any way problematic? Like, I mean, from my point of view, I think it's something valid to like try to empower marginalized low-income communities, especially from the developing world, to electrify, but in other ways, like, it's not their problem, like it's not a problem they created. And for like lithium-ion batteries, the end-of-life perspective is rarely considered. Credits like this also rarely considered, like how they're supposed to replace the battery. In a place like this, there's also less access to waste management for technologies like this one. And it's also a situation where, like, in a country like Ghana, if they keep burning oil, the contribution to global emissions is so low compared to, like, let's say America, that in some ways it can be found problematic. Like, I wanted to know, like, what's your opinion on like this duality where, there is a sense of like empowering these communities, but in some ways it can also be perceived as something problematic.
Mm-hmm. So I think that my main thought is, what are we empowering these people to do? And is that what they wanted to be empowered to do? Right. So I totally agree with your point on the battery cost of the replacement is often not considered. And in Ghana, they had rolled out a lot of solar home systems just to have those systems abandoned after 5 years when the battery went up. And then people went back to doing exactly what they did. And they were like, see, it's a good thing we kept all this infrastructure for our wood burning and things. And now that was just a waste of time, right? But the issue is when you come in and you disrupt the kerosene industry, right? And you don't replace that. So now you've caused higher levels of economic poverty, because now you've taken out those jobs and you didn't actually create structures in place to create an industry in country for this other market, right? And so I think that that's why I harp so much on, designing systems for large scale jobs of manufacturing. Like, people want solar panels built in their country. People in Ghana were telling me that they don't have any car manufacturing in country. All the cars are imported, right? And so it's very extractive, right? We're extracting the raw materials and we're going to build the technology somewhere else, and then we're going to sell it back to you, right? And that's not what they want. I mean, even the chief was like, I want a sustainable wind turbine because I want to grind my grains and I want to generate jobs, right? And so that's what people want to be empowered to do. And I do think that there's a lot of focus on indoor air pollution, and that health problem is very important, but also I think that people will willingly switch when they feel empowered to have enough money to make their own choices, because no mother wants to have their baby in a really smoky house, right? but the mother also wants to be able to feed that baby, right? And generate clean water and have electricity that is safer than than burning fires in your homes. It's a natural desire. And people will do that when they have the money and the ability to switch on their own.
There's a question that's come in off the internet from Zoom from someone called Sarah Hanau. Biden has an initiative that requires at least 40% of the benefits of investment in clean energy and water infrastructure to go towards disadvantaged communities. What's your opinion of this, and how does this idea of a disadvantaged community operate in relation to the people in energy policy?
Okay. So for the Justice 40 initiative, I really like the policy concept.
Okay.
I think that's why I started looking more at metrics, though, because the question is, what does a benefit look like, right? So when we were talking with a technology deployment company, they were saying that we deployed all these energy efficient technologies, but now people just consume more, so it didn't lower the percent of income that they spent on the bill, so the program was a failure. And I'm like, really? So we're going to leave that? We don't want to talk about, where people wanted to get to, if they're, feeling safer in their homes, are they like, spending that money on something else? Do they actually get closer to where they want to be, right? We're just going to say, oh, you still spend 10% of your income. And so now, we're not going to keep deploying this. And so I think when we are looking at the Justice 40, we need to really ask ourselves, like, what does a benefit look like? But I agree with the policy, like as a policy, because it's really about restorative justice. So restorative justice really focuses on trying to make sure that people who have historically been disadvantaged get the benefits, right? And I think without, putting that in a policy, we're not going to correct the historical injustices of a system.
Okay, great. Good time for one more question, I think. There's somebody here.
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned that writing off utility debt is not a sustainable business practice, but you also mentioned RECs and how it shows that like almost 30% of Americans are energy insecure. And obviously there's a huge racial and income disparity there, as well as ownership of the house. Renters have a much higher energy burden. So if we are having these structures that are perpetually keeping people poor and impoverished, what does it say about providing such a basic service through a business that's profit maximizing and shareholder owned? Or is that not necessarily the go-to solution you would look into?
Well, I think that your question really touches on this larger issue of, electricity started off as a luxury good, and we still act like it is, even though we've tied all of our basic needs to it, right? And I think that is something that people have tried to tackle in more regulated markets, right, and more vertically integrated utilities. But then the issue is you don't have the innovation, right? You're not having a lot of new generators come into play, and the vertically integrated utilities are slower to adopt new technologies, right? And so then there is this development and transition. Let the markets do what they want, but also like we need to protect the customer piece. And so I think with the way that we operate our energy system, we need to get a good handle on how much do people actually need, because we do that for water, right? You can't just shut off a person's water in I think a month, right? It is decided as a basic need. Also, if you need to go to the hospital and you're in hospital debt, they cannot deny you at the emergency room, right? And so I think that there are avenues where we can think, really creatively about how to change this industry. Could it be that you can bill your insurance company? If your hospital tells you have to get this oxygen tank, that is very electricity intensive, and you can bill your insurance for that, right? Why? I mean, it's a health thing. Why is it easier to get opioids than it is to get energy assistance, right? So I feel like I don't know the perfect solution. I won't claim to know it, but I do think that just because it's a profit maximizing business doesn't mean that we have to, one, keep it that way, but also that we can't figure out other ways to both, have that business run while minimizing energy poverty. And I think that it's just going to involve different structures. So, you know, energy customers can subsidize each other, right? So the high income users, when we're thinking about rate increases, in Ghana, they have different rates for different income groups, right? And so then you sign into a rate. And because we want everybody to hit a basic level of energy usage. And so in Ghana, I think for it's either 50 kilowatt hours and below, you got the subsidy. If you're a low usage user, then you get subsidized. And then everybody else above that, you don't get that benefit. And I think historically, we have charged people less for using more. And I think that now we're going to have to start changing that.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on, you know, the New York plan, the New York State plan to, you know, have a carbon-free grid by 2050 using mainly renewables, as well as start charging everybody excessive fines if they don't, you know, if they emit too much greenhouse gas. What is the practicality of that? And what would be the impact on energy poverty? Have you done any research or thoughts on that?
So I haven't done research on the New York policy specifically, but my PhD was in New England. I think that one of the biggest challenges for reaching a super clean grid in this Northeast region is deployment of offshore wind. Because like, you know, we couldn't even get Cape Wind, right? And so when we're trying to do the 100% clean grid without offshore wind, or, you know, we only have 6 turbines off the coast of Rhode Island. We're going to need a lot more deployment, a lot quicker to reach these targets. And also then we're going to need to deploy a lot more storage as well. So I think that that can be a big challenge for reaching these. And then another, I guess, solution that often people propose is, okay, well, if we can't get the offshore wind, we'll just build out more transmission, right? But in Boston, they couldn't get the transmission because New Hampshire just no, doesn't benefit us. We're not going to do it. But you're like, well, actually, the grid is kind of connected, you know, and so it kind of benefits everybody. So I think that that's one challenge. I'm being told to stop though, so we're over time.
Okay, thanks. So thanks very much for being here, folks. I'm Geoff Hill from the business school, by the way, and I spent the afternoon teaching a bunch of students exactly the stuff that we've been hearing about right now, the energy transition and so on. And thank you very much indeed, Destenie. It was very thought-provoking, very, very interesting indeed. I think there's a lot of ideas you've put on the surface here, and people will go away thinking about these things for a long time. So thanks very much indeed for being here.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.